Within the folds of modern science appears perhaps the greatest untold story of our generation. It is the simple but seismic truth that the psyche is capable of gleaning information beyond the five senses and all known technology. In plainest terms, this capacity is called extrasensory perception, or ESP. Decades of replicated and bulletproof findings validate this rejected fact of human nature. We are beings both material and immaterial, physically limited and elevated by laws and forces we've only begun to codify. Join me, Mitch Horowitz, as I explore the history, struggles, and proofs of parapsychology, uncovering the extraordinary evidence that ESP is real. Episode 1, Moonrise. The premise of our exploration is simple. ESP is real, or rather, as put by pioneering 20th century parapsychologist J.B. Rhine, it does really occur.
Dr. Rhine, if ESP really exists, what are its implications?
Well, it does really exist. It does really occur, we'd say. The implications begin with the basic fact that ESP is non-physical. It shows that there's something that man can do that extends beyond space-time. That's tremendous. That's like discovering another continent, a new world. First, take religion. Most of the world is religious. What is the greatest enemy to religion, or the greatest weakness in the position of religion? The fact that it cannot successfully refute the growing conception in the world of science that man is a wholly physical being. That is, it's the position of materialism. If religion could refute materialism, it would be in a much firmer, sounder position, because it stands on the assumption that there's something spiritual or extra-physical about man. Parapsychology establishes that in this experimental evidence of ESP and other abilities.
Our methods for proving this verity are providing the factual story and replicable data the public hasn't heard. To reveal both, we'll venture from gaslit séances in 19th-century log cabins to clinical trials at 21st-century universities. For millennia, humanity has pursued higher knowing. In antiquity, soldiers and statesmen turned to oracles, such as the prophetess at Delphi and pictogrammatic language of the I Ching. Seen from a certain perspective, nearly all religion predates science as the wish to know first causes. In that vein, religion is never fully separable from science and often returns to intersect with it. Just as our generation is seeing convergence in conversation around theoretical physics or quantum theory and metaphysics or unseen antecedents. Many ancient Neoplatonic and Hermetic tracts, the last being a compact of Greek-Egyptian thought, touched on the expansive powers of the psyche, a theme that repeatedly re-entered modern life. Until his death in 1815, occult healer Franz Anton Mesmer promulgated theories of a mysterious life force called animal magnetism. Yet the healer's protégés edged away from notions of etheric energies. They adopted a more proto-psychological language. One of the most gifted of them, the Marquis de Puysegur, undertook experiments in France in late 1784 and early 1785 that persuaded him that the suggestive powers of the mesmerist and his rapport with the patient were the forces at work. As Eric Davis notes in his 1998 Technosis, British Dr. James Braid, around 1840, came up with the term hypnotism to describe such magnetic procedures, and researches into the hypnotic state would eventually lead a young Sigmund Freud, whom we'll meet again, to develop his early theories of the unconscious. Though little was left of Mesmer's original tactics at that point, Freud did resemble the old magnetizer in attempting to heal the nervous conditions of his patients by exploring altered states of consciousness in a scientific manner, all the while exploiting the almost magical rapport between patient and doctor. In 1835, idealist philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called this source the light of speculative thought, defining experience of self and world not only in image, but in fact. Prior to Freud, current concepts of the subconscious or unconscious mind did not exist throughout the 18th and even much of the 19th centuries. The notion of a subliminal, subconscious, or unconscious mind did not spread until the 1890s, thanks in part to the efforts of philosopher-scientists F.W.H. Myers and William James. James believed that science made two critical errors. It overemphasized theory in place of evidence, because his attitude was that evidence establishes the reality of things, not an elegant theory that seems to cover the bases. Theory has its place, but his wish was to emphasize empiricism and evidence. And he despaired over the tendencies of established science to discount testimony, which it derisively called anecdote. And in medicine, for example, as soon as something was classified as anecdote, it was the equivalent of classifying a doctor's work as quackery. It was a mark of Cain, and there was no washing it off. And we still struggle with this, even in 21st century science. It's the same issues that James dealt with in Victorian science. Where is room for testimony? In fact, we use testimony all the time. We don't fully know how SSRIs or SNRIs work, if indeed they do really work. We don't fully know. The patient will sit with the doctor and talk about his or her experience, and they'll decide, well, do we want to tweak this? Do we want to try that? It's testimony. The patient who's suffering from pain in a hospital, well, pain is a subjective state. He or she will be shown a chart of faces going from smiley face to frowny face and explain to the medical professional, this is the pain I'm experiencing. We detect all kinds of things in the fields of medicine, psychology, social science from nothing other than testimony. And so James felt that testimony needed to be respected, not wiped away as anecdotes. So as both a philosopher and a psychologist, as a person who was so deeply ensconced in the structures of science, but also objected to the way that those structures excluded ideas or verities, he was the perfect person to provide this bridge between modernist science and what would become parapsychology. If modernist philosophy possesses a key purpose or principle, it is this: pursuit of underlying factors. The defining premise of modernist philosophy is that life, in all its expressions, results from unseen but detectable antecedents. In politics, this might mean economic clashes and inevitable cycles of revolution, Marx. In biology, evolution and natural selection, Darwin. In psychology, childhood trauma and sexual repression, Freud. In physics, time-space relativity, Einstein. In human performance, self-image, James. In health and illness, germs and microbes, Pasteur, and so forth across myriad fields. I believe that the modernist approach must also encompass the extra-physical, where empiricism is evident and repeatable. What else is science but methodological replication. That applies to both physicality and extra-physicality. The aim of parapsychology is pursuit of first causes that physicalist premises fail to cover. Romantically put, the prospect that humanity is capable of parting the veil to the unknown experienced unexpected new life with the advent of spiritualism in the mid-19th century. This movement of talking to the dead played out in the most ordinary environs of American life. Beginning around 1848, modern séances emerged in village hamlets, cabin kitchens, and local granges, eventually winding their way even to the Lincoln White House. In April 1863, in the presence of a reporter from the Boston Gazette, Abraham Lincoln hosted a séance in the Crimson Room of the White House. When the medium told Lincoln that an Indian spirit wished to convey a message, the president replied, "Well, sir, I should be happy to hear what His Indian Majesty has to say. We have recently had a visitation from our red brethren, and it was the only delegation, black, white, or blue, which did not volunteer some advice about the conduct of the war." Whether out of novelty or devotion, about 10% of Americans in the mid-19th century participated in spiritualism. Why did séance circles and midnight raps grow so popular so quickly? Many mediums came from ordinary working life, encouraging the everyday seeker that the age of prophecy or seership was not tucked into the biblical past, but available in the here and now. Many, too, were women, a seismic change in the culture in which women were, for the first time in modern life, able to openly function as religious and civic leaders of a sort. There grew an immediate and lasting symbiosis between spiritualism and suffragism. In July 1848, about 6 months after Kate and Margaret Fox introduced the Rochester Rappings, the gavel fell on the watershed Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights, about 40 miles east of the Fox home down Route 20, the Psychic Highway. Indeed, for about 2 generations in the 19th century, you could not find a suffragist activist who had not spent some time at the séance table, or a séance habitué who was not active in, or at least sympathetic toward suffragism. Insecure in her public speaking abilities, the usually skeptical Susan B. Anthony wrote to her colleague Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1855, "If the spirits would only just make me a trance medium and put the right thing into my mouth, you can't think of how earnestly I have prayed to be made a speaking medium for a whole week." In 1853, suffragist Mary Fenn Love convened the first New York State Women's Rights Convention. "Spiritualism has inaugurated the era of woman," she announced. 2 years later, Mary married the movement's reigning prophet, Andrew Jackson Davis. Validating Fenn's declaration, spiritualism provided a unique springboard for women to enter politics in an era before suffrage. On January 11, 1871, Congress hosted the first woman to address a joint committee. That winter day, free love advocate and avowed trance medium Victoria Woodhull took the floor. Poised and handsome, Woodhull delivered a rousing brief in defense of voting rights known as the Woodhull Memorial. The medium, famous for her sittings with magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, told journalists that the address was dictated to her in a dream by a ghostly, tunic-wearing Greek elder, a spirit guardian who guided her since she was little.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and every one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Woman suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
Stay tuned in for even more extraordinary evidence after the break. Another factor in the spread of spiritualism was that moderns staggered under the grief of disease and war, including losses of children. In New York City in 1853, half of all reported deaths were children under age 5. "And oh, mother that reads this," wrote Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, "has there never been in your house a drawer or a closet, the opening of which has been to you like the opening again of a little grave? Ah, happy mother that you are, if it has not been so." For acolytes, the hope of contact soothed the agony of loss. Grieving parents, widows and widowers, or those simply pursuing otherworldly thrills, huddled in clubs and parlor rooms, schoolhouses and churches to reach out to the dead, and many avowed that such contact came. In darkened rooms, tables lifted and rocked, disembodied knocks cracked through the night air, and trance mediums spoke in otherworldly voices. "I am here, mother," a medium might intone as a listener sobbed and squeezed the hands of those on either side of her. Questions of after-death survival soon moved beyond cabins, clubs, and parlors. Beginning in 1870, British physicist Sir William Crookes, a pioneer in microphysics and cathode ray studies, used the pages of the Quarterly Journal of Science to endeavor a study of psychical phenomena and spiritualist claims, employing at least the coordinates and basic methods of scientific study. "No observations are of much use to the student of science unless they are truthful and made under test conditions," he wrote. "And here I find the great mass of spiritualistic evidence to fail." In particular, Crookes studied the physical mediumship claims of Scottish-American psychic Daniel Douglas Hume and conducted sittings with New Yorker Kate Fox of the famous Rochester Rappings of 1848. In Crookes' experiments with Hume, the physicist thought he detected some kind of psychic force. In 1871, the Royal Society, Britain's premier academy of sciences, rejected 2 of the Crookes reports. One scientist working alone or with ad hoc colleagues could not get very far. But what if there existed a more concerted and organized effort? These were the lines along which some of Crookes' contemporaries were already thinking. Organized psychical research can be dated symbolically from a conversation between philosopher Henry Sidgwick and his student F.W.H. Myers one moonlit night in Cambridge about 1870 over the need to validate religious belief through the methods of empirical science, wrote historians Seymour H. Mouskoff and Michael R. McVaugh in their invaluable study of psi research, The Elusive Science. That this monumental historical work is out of print typifies the current crisis of reaching the public with reliable information on parapsychology. In any case, as a thought stream, the era of parapsychology, scientific study of the supernatural, had begun. but the term and lattice work around it were not yet in place. It wasn't until 1882 that the British Society for Psychical Research was formed. Its moment seemed almost preordained as a who's who of scientists and statesmen swelled its ranks, including Myers, who coined the term telepathy for mind-to-mind communication, American psychologist and philosopher William James, physicist Oliver Lodge, Sigmund Freud, a member of both the British and American chapters, economist and ethical philosopher Sidgwick, and Arthur Balfour, Britain's prime minister from 1902 to 1905. Crookes, in the late 1890s, served as its president. At its inception, parapsychology sought to test mediumistic phenomena under controlled conditions. The early SPR worked with rigor to hold spirit mediums to proof. Researchers such as the strong-willed Richard Hodgson and James himself ventured to the séance table intent on safeguarding against fraud and documenting claimed phenomena, including physical mediumship, after-death communication, and clairvoyance, or what is today called channeling. 20th-century medical psychic Edgar Cayce first used the term channel in a metaphysical sense in the early 1930s. They probed unexplained cases, exposed frauds, and created historical controversies that have lingered until today. In 1886, William James issued a confirmatory initial report on American medium Lenora Piper, followed by continued SPR investigations by Hodgson. This lady can at will pass into a trance condition, James wrote, in which she is controlled by a power purporting to be the spirit of a French doctor who serves as an intermediary between the sitter and deceased friends. I have myself witnessed a dozen of her trances and have testimony at first hand from 25 sitters, to whom the medium reported intimate details that James avowed she had no means of knowing, such as the location of a lost bank check, the disclosures of a hidden letter, and a rocking chair that strangely creaked in James's home. In 1887, James turned the reins of investigating Mrs. Piper over to his colleague Richard Hodgson. Just 2 years earlier, Hodgson, a notoriously strong-willed investigator, had issued a damning report on the activities of Russian occultist Madame H.P. Blavatsky. His conclusions, which were profoundly hard on the Russian mystic, remain controversial to this day. In any case, Hodgson was not an investigator to be trifled with. Upon his first anonymous sitting with Mrs. Piper, he found that she accurately described his first love, Jessie, noting a birthmark and a book of poems that Hodgson had once given to the woman, and also that Hodgson heard about his love's death from Jessie's sister, all confirmed as true by a shocked investigator. He worked with her for several years ahead and clocked dozens upon dozens of similar cases where Mrs. Piper, introduced to subjects around whom every safeguard had been taken, was able to identify intimate and remarkably specific details that eluded the detection of any kind of fraud or subterfuge. 1886 also marked publication of the 2-volume Phantasms of the Living by Edmund Gurney, F.W.H. Myers, and Frank Podmore, which explored 702 cases of spontaneous and crisis apparitions, such as the appearance of an endangered loved one at a critical or fatal moment. We sometimes encounter persons, the authors wrote, who allege that they have repeatedly experienced some occult sort of perception of what was happening to friends or relatives at a distance. As a rule, their statements have no force at all as evidence for telepathy, partly because we have no means of judging how far the idea of the distant event may have been suggested in some normal way, partly because the impressions have not been recorded at the time, and it is especially easy to suppose that failures may have been forgotten while a lucky guess has been remembered. We have, however, one example of marked correspondence where two witnesses were concerned, each of whom professes to have had other similar experiences, and where the particular incident narrated is adequately confirmed. By way of example, one of the cases in the meticulously cataloged study offers this account.
When we were living at Leamington,
A woman wrote,
I had a remarkable vision. I was sleeping with my sister Maria. Suddenly, the curtains of our bed at the side I slept were undrawn, and Mr. L appeared standing there. He said, addressing me by name,
"My mother is dead."
I tried to persuade myself I had been dreaming, and Maria said I had dreamt it. But after a short time, the same thing was done again, and the same announcement made. I was rather chafed at breakfast because of the story I told. After breakfast, I went into the drawing room to practice. Presently, I heard myself called, and I went out on the balcony to listen. It was the daughter of the man whom I had seen twice at night, and the granddaughter of the old lady whose death had been announced. She was riding on horseback. She said, "Have you heard? My father is sent for, and my grandmother is dead."
The percipient's sister confirmed the events.
We have very good experience that people can accurately describe events that are hours or days in the future. What one must say is that the viewer in the laboratory is describing some future event that they will experience. That would be the customary way to describe this. We think a more accurate description would be that some future event which will take place causes the viewer at an earlier time to have an experience.
More extraordinary evidence when we return. In actuality, German philosopher and psychologist Max de Soir coined the term parapsychology in 1889, but de Soir himself later became a skeptic of psychical or extraphysical phenomena, showing how fraught the new field would eventually prove. In the 1880s, Nobel laureate and SPR president Charles Richet, one of France's most highly regarded biologists, studied telepathy with subjects under hypnosis. Richet also introduced the use of statistical analysis in ESP test cards, presaging today's near-universal use of statistics throughout the psychological and social sciences. Yet controversies, from the physicalist claims of occultist Madame H.P. Blavatsky to the piano-floating phenomena of Daniel Douglas Hume to William James's prize medium Leonora Piper, often burned brighter than findings. By the end of the decade, definitive answers seemed no closer, but certain exceptional cases resisted mundane explanation. In William James's 1896 presidential address to the SPR, the philosopher famously remarked, "If I may employ the language of the professional logic shop, a universal proposition can be made untrue by a particular instance. If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, you must not seek to show that no crows are. It is enough if you prove one single crow to be white. My own white crow is Mrs. Piper. In the trances of this medium, I cannot resist the conviction that knowledge appears, which she has never gained by the ordinary waking use of her eyes and ears and wits. What the source of this knowledge may be, I know not, and have not the glimmer of an explanatory suggestion to make. But from admitting the fact of such knowledge, I can see no escape. So, when I turn to the rest of the evidence, ghosts and all, I cannot carry with me the irreversibly negative bias of the rigorously scientific mind, with its presumption as to what the true order of nature ought to be. These were scientists who were coming of age post-Darwin. And there's no question that the sciences, including medicine, were organizing themselves along new lines. And this was reflected in America, for example, in licensing requirements to practice medicine that would create a certain uniformity in all states in the nation. And there were vast improvements in American medicine in particular, which had been a shambles in the 1890s. Along with that, there was, and these were, of course, necessary reforms that saved lives, prolonged lives, prevented illnesses. But there was a hubris which came with it, which William James in particular was very frustrated by. The hubris announced itself by passing prohibitory laws against alternative practitioners in medicine, and I think subjecting people who were involved in spiritualism to mockery and expulsion from organs, schools, or publications of serious influence. There had been fraud, and there's no question about that. But James took it upon his shoulders, as did Myers and Sidgwick and others, to insist that there lingered serious, purposeful, necessary questions, even in the face of that fraud. They were, by nature, I would say, scientists who also harbored either a belief in the extraphysical or were indifferent to questions of belief, if any of us can be said to be, and were attracted by a nagging empiricism which they were trying to hone. I suspect the pushback they met with was a lot like what people experience in the 21st century. Things have not culturally changed that much in this particular pocket of inquiry. And there was a arrogant, generalist, brutally short-handed confidence among most devotees of the physical sciences that William James and his collaborators were distinguished people who had gone off track down a road from which there was no return. So it was a strange world in which these scientists could find themselves both within and outside the mainstream. And there were sophisticated frauds, which I think later figures like Harry Houdini came to feel that good-natured, well-trained scientists were not adequate to deal with. I mentioned Geoffrey Hodgson, who was an Australian investigator, very sharp-elbowed, very aggressive, intensively learned. And I think, in fact, the SPR did uncover dozens upon dozens of frauds, ventured into the séance room and exposed fakery, and yet also exposed its opposite, situations that really begged further exploration. For the most part, not entirely, investigators were meeting mediums on their own turf, which might have put them at a disadvantage. But I think that the introduction of a lab structure into psychical research was really necessary before it could take a step forward. SPR researchers faced another barrier. They were functioning largely within Victorian parlor rooms. On the whole, investigators were not operating in clinical environments, so-called white coat lab settings, where an atmosphere of experimenter control abetted seeking evidence for extraphysical phenomena, whether in statistical patterns or documentation of observed events. The American chapter of the SPR, meanwhile, grew stymied by factional disputes between members primarily interested in the after-death survival thesis versus those committed to the more conservative direction of documenting mental phenomena. Some investigators wondered, have we cast too far a net? Why not limit study of the supernatural, for now, to mental or psychical phenomena such as clairvoyance, telepathy, and premonition? Might a narrowed focus net new results and bring us nearer the truth, if any is to be found at all? The answer, still nestled into future decades, is a decided and remarkable yes. Thank you for listening to Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. This series was produced by Jim Perry and John McEdward for SpectreVision Radio. Edited by John McEdward, with original music by Dean Hurley. Written and narrated by me, Mitch Horowitz. Join us for Episode 2, Institute for Experimental Religion, where we meet the man who finally transforms parapsychology into an academically recognized science and provides replicable statistical evidence of an unseen world.
If religion could refute materialism, it would be in a much firmer, sounder position, because it stands on the assumption that there's something spiritual or extra-physical about man.